Before humans learned to leave marks on stone, before language crystallized into symbols and memory became history, an invisible dialogue had already begun. It unfolded silently within bodies, across generations, beneath the threshold of perception, shaping life not through sudden catastrophe alone, but through slow, relentless pressure. The true architects of human evolution were not only climate shifts or predators stalking the savannah, but microscopic entities that neither announced their presence nor negotiated their influence. Bacteria, viruses, and other microbial agents became intimate companions to human biology, long before humans could name themselves as a species, altering survival pathways, genetic expression, and even the structure of societies through forces that operated entirely outside conscious awareness. What we call human today is inseparable from this ancient and ongoing invasion, a biological co-authorship written not in ink or stone, but in DNA. To imagine early human evolution without considering microbes is to read only half a text. Every migration out of Africa, every shift from nomadic hunting to sedentary agriculture, every concentration of bodies into villages and cities multiplied microbial encounters exponentially. Pathogens did not merely follow humans, they anticipated them, adapted alongside them, and exploited every new ecological niche created by human behavior. In this sense, evolution did not proceed as a simple competition between humans and their environment, but as a dynamic negotiation with organisms that evolved faster, reproduced more efficiently, and exerted selective pressure with ruthless precision. The immune system itself did not emerge as a defensive luxury, but as an evolutionary necessity forged under constant microbial siege, shaped by countless encounters that favored those genetic configurations capable of survival under invisible assault. What makes this process uniquely unsettling is its intimacy. Unlike predators or natural disasters, microbes do not confront humans from the outside. They enter, inhabit, replicate, and sometimes integrate into the very machinery of life. Viral sequences embedded within the human genome are not anomalies, but historical records, molecular fossils of ancient infections that permanently altered genetic architecture. Some of these sequences, once weapons of invasion, were later repurposed by evolution itself, contributing to essential functions such as placental development and immune modulation. In this way, humanity did not merely resist microbial invaders, it absorbed them, co-opted them, and allowed them to become part of what it means to be human. The immune system, often imagined as a static shield, is in reality a memory archive of microbial warfare. Each response is informed by ancestral encounters encoded through selection rather than recollection. The distinction between self and non-self, fundamental to immune recognition, is not an abstract philosophical boundary, but a biological compromise refined through millennia of exposure. Too aggressive a response invites autoimmunity and self-destruction. Too passive a response invites infection and extinction. This balance was not designed. It was negotiated under pressure, with survival as the only metric of success. Entire populations were shaped by these negotiations, as epidemics selectively removed genetic configurations ill-suited to particular microbial environments while amplifying others. As humans transitioned into agricultural societies, this microbial dialogue intensified. Domesticated animals introduced new zoonotic pathways, while stored food and permanent settlements created breeding grounds for pathogens previously limited by mobility and dispersion. Diseases that require sustained human-to-human transmission found fertile ground in growing populations, transforming microbes from sporadic threats into structural forces, shaping demography, mortality rates, and social organization. Cultural practices emerged not only from symbolic or economic needs, but from biological necessity, as communities adapted behaviors to mitigate invisible risks they could not see but could sense through recurring loss and survival patterns. Urbanization further amplified this process, turning cities into evolutionary laboratories, where microbes and humans co-evolved at unprecedented speed. Dense populations, shared water sources, and trade networks spanning continents created pathways for pathogens to spread faster than immunity could adapt. In response, human societies developed collective strategies, from quarantine and burial rituals to medical institutions and public health infrastructures, all shaped by the pressure exerted by unseen adversaries. These structures, often attributed to cultural advancement alone, can also be read as evolutionary responses to microbial realities, social immune systems, designed to compensate for biological limitations. Yet the influence of microbes extended beyond physiology and infrastructure into cognition and behavior. Chronic infections, inflammatory responses, and immune activation subtly altered neurological development and emotional regulation, influencing temperament, risk tolerance, and social interaction. The boundary between biology and culture blurred further as microbial exposure influenced not only who survived, but how survivors perceived the world. Fear of contamination, ritual purification, and symbolic associations between illness and morality did not emerge in a vacuum. They reflected deep evolutionary memories of vulnerability to forces that could not be confronted directly. Even reproductive strategies were shaped by microbial pressure. Mate selection, kinship structures, and population mixing patterns influenced immune diversity, particularly through mechanisms related to genetic variability in immune response genes. Groups that maintained sufficient diversity were better equipped to withstand novel infections, while isolated populations faced catastrophic collapse when exposed to unfamiliar pathogens. History records these events as conquests or discoveries, but beneath the surface they were microbial exchanges with disproportionate evolutionary consequences. The modern world, despite its technological defenses, remains embedded in this ancient relationship. Antibiotics, vaccines, and sanitation did not end microbial evolution. They redirected it. Pathogens adapted, resistance emerged, and new equilibria formed. At the same time, the human microbiome, the vast internal ecosystem of beneficial microbes, revealed that not all invasions were hostile. Many microorganisms became indispensable partners, shaping digestion, immunity, and even mental health. The realization that human health depends on microbial balance rather than microbial absence reframed the narrative from one of war to one of coexistence, though always under the shadow of potential imbalance. What remains consistent across this entire evolutionary arc is the asymmetry of awareness. Microbes respond to selective pressure without intention, while humans interpret their impact through culture, belief, and meaning. This asymmetry created narratives of punishment, destiny, or divine intervention long before germ theory provided alternative explanations. Even now, with advanced understanding, the emotional resonance of epidemics reveals how deeply embedded these invisible forces are in collective memory. Fear spreads faster than infection, shaping behavior in ways that can either mitigate or amplify biological threats. To understand human evolution, therefore, is to accept that agency is distributed across scales far smaller than human perception. The story of humanity is not solely one of conscious adaptation, but of continuous reshaping by forces that operate below awareness, rewriting genetic instructions one generation at a time. Each immune response, each inherited resistance, each vulnerability carries the imprint of ancient encounters that never entered recorded history, yet determined its possibility. Humans did not merely survive these silent invasions, they were defined by them, molded into a species whose biology, culture, and social complexity bear the signatures of microbial influence at every level. This perspective challenges comforting narratives of human exceptionalism, replacing them with a more unsettling truth, that human identity is porous, contingent, and co-constructed with entities that neither share intentions nor recognize boundaries. The evolution of humanity cannot be disentangled from the evolution of microbes, because the two processes are not parallel but intertwined. To exist as human is to carry within oneself the residue of countless invasions, compromises, and integrations that occurred long before conscious choice was possible, and that continue to unfold with every breath, every contact, every exchange, in a world still governed by forces too small, to see yet too powerful to ignore. If the first phase of human evolution under microbial pressure can be described as unconscious adaptation, the second phase reveals something more complex: the gradual emergence of feedback loops between biological vulnerability and social organization. As pathogens began to exert predictable patterns of mortality and survival, human groups did not merely endure them, but reorganized around them, often without explicit awareness of the causal agent. Entire social norms, from kinship obligations to settlement layouts, can be reinterpreted as stabilizing responses to recurring microbial stress, shaping how humans lived together long before they understood why certain arrangements proved more resilient than others. The selective force of disease did not operate evenly across populations. It carved differences along geographical, genetic, and cultural lines, creating gradients of resistance and susceptibility that persist in subtle forms even today. Genes associated with immune response diversified rapidly under pressure from local pathogen environments, producing populations finely tuned to specific microbial ecologies. What appeared outwardly as cultural divergence often concealed deep biological adaptation, where dietary practices, hygiene rituals, and even clothing customs reinforced survival advantages in pathogen-rich environments. These practices were transmitted as tradition rather than theory, encoded in habit rather than explanation. Yet they functioned as extensions of immune defense at the societal level. One of the most profound consequences of microbial pressure was the shaping of collective memory through trauma. Epidemics did not simply kill. They restructured populations, erased lineages, and created demographic vacuums that altered power dynamics and cultural continuity. Survivors inherited not only genes but behavioral imprints shaped by loss, fear, and avoidance. Over generations, these imprints crystallized into mythologies, taboos, and moral frameworks that frame disease as a consequence, test, or punishment, embedding biological vulnerability into symbolic systems that govern meaning and behavior. In this way, microbes influenced not only survival but interpretation, shaping how humans made sense of suffering itself. The relationship between microbes and human cognition extended further into developmental pathways. Early life exposure to pathogens trained immune systems, but also influenced neurological development through inflammatory signaling, subtly affecting learning, stress response, and emotional regulation. These effects, distributed across populations, contributed to variability in temperament and social behavior that in turn influenced group dynamics. Cooperative tendencies, risk aversion, and even patterns of leadership can be partially traced to biological environments saturated with microbial threat, where certain psychological profiles conferred adaptive advantages under constant uncertainty. As trade networks expanded, microbes became inadvertent passengers, traveling across continents embedded within human movement. The collision of previously isolated pathogen ecosystems produced events of staggering evolutionary consequence, where populations lacking immunological familiarity face catastrophic mortality. These encounters, often framed as historical turning points driven by conquest or exploration, reveal a deeper layer of causality when viewed through a microbial lens. Power did not shift solely because of weapons or strategy, but because invisible allies reshaped survival probabilities long before political outcomes were decided. The human genome bears the scars and signatures of these encounters in ways that challenge linear notions of progress. Certain genetic traits that once conferred resistance later became liabilities under new environmental conditions, illustrating that evolution does not optimize universally but contextually. What protected one generation might predispose another to chronic inflammation, autoimmune disorders, or metabolic dysfunction when microbial landscapes change. The legacy of ancient adaptation thus persists as modern vulnerability, revealing the long shadow cast by microbial history over contemporary health. This becomes particularly evident in the modern era, where reduced exposure to certain microbes coincides with rising immune dysregulation. The immune system, calibrated for constant microbial interaction, encounters environments stripped of ancestral stimuli, leading to maladaptive responses against benign triggers. Allergies, autoimmune diseases, and inflammatory conditions emerge not as failures of immunity, but as echoes of an evolutionary mismatch between biological expectation and modern reality. The very systems shaped by ancient invasions struggle to recalibrate in sanitized environments, exposing the paradox that absence can be as disruptive as excess. The human microbiome complicates this narrative further by dissolving the boundary between invader and ally. Trillions of microorganisms inhabit the human body, forming ecosystems that influence digestion, immunity, and even mood regulation. These microbes are not passive residents, but active participants in metabolic and signaling networks, co-evolving with their host in intricate balance. Disruption of this balance through antibiotics, diet, or lifestyle can cascade into systemic effects, underscoring how deeply integrated microbial life has become within human physiology. What was once framed as invasion is now understood as symbiosis, the one that remains precariously dependent on equilibrium. This realization reframes evolution itself as a process of negotiated coexistence rather than domination. Humans did not defeat microbes. They adapted alongside them, forming layered systems of defense, tolerance, and integration. Each adaptation reshaped the selective landscape, prompting microbial counter-adaptation in an endless feedback loop that continues unabated. The illusion of control, fostered by modern medicine, obscures this reality, creating a narrative of mastery that collapses whenever new pathogens emerge or old ones evolve resistance. The underlying dynamics remain unchanged. Rapid microbial evolution meets slower human adaptation, mediated through culture, technology, and biology. Social structures evolved under this pressure to manage risk collectively, transforming individual vulnerability into shared responsibility. The emergence of caregiving roles, communal healing practices, and later institutional medicine reflects an evolutionary shift toward collective survival strategies. These systems, while culturally expressed, are biologically rooted in the necessity of mitigating microbial threat beyond individual capacity. Even moral imperatives surrounding care for the sick can be interpreted as adaptations that enhanced group resilience, ensuring continuity in the face of inevitable infection. Language itself may bear traces of microbial influence, as metaphors of purity, contamination, and corruption permeate moral and political discourse. The symbolic extension of disease into social categories reveals how deeply biological experience shapes abstraction. Fear of infection becomes fear of otherness, reinforcing boundaries that serve both protective and exclusionary functions. These dynamics demonstrate how microbial pressure shaped not only survival strategies, but the conceptual frameworks through which humans interpret difference, risk, and belonging. As scientific understanding advanced, the narrative shifted from mysticism to mechanism, yet the underlying relationship remained unchanged. Germ theory did not eliminate microbial influence, it rendered it visible, translating ancient pressures into modern interventions. Vaccination, sanitation, and antibiotics altered selective environments, reducing mortality but introducing new evolutionary challenges. Microbes adapted, resistance emerged, and the cycle continued, reminding humanity that technological solutions operate within evolutionary constraints rather than outside them. The persistence of emerging diseases underscores the continuity of this relationship. Novel pathogens exploit ecological disruption, population density, and global connectivity, revealing vulnerabilities embedded within modern systems. These events are not anomalies, but expressions of the same forces that shaped early human evolution, amplified by scale and speed. Each outbreak reactivates ancient patterns of fear, adaptation, and social reorganization. demonstrating that the silent invasion is not a relic of the past, but an ongoing process woven into the fabric of human existence. To recognize this continuity is to confront an uncomfortable truth, that human evolution is not a closed chapter, but an active negotiation still unfolding. The genetic, immunological, and social consequences of microbial interaction continue to accumulate, shaping future trajectories in ways that resist prediction. Understanding this dynamic requires abandoning narratives of linear progress in favor of a more nuanced appreciation of coevolution, where survival emerges from balance rather than victory. What distinguishes the later stages of human interaction with microbial forces is not an increase in control, but an increase in complexity. As scientific understanding advanced, humans did not step outside the evolutionary dialogue with microbes. Rather, they added new layers to it, often accelerating dynamics that were once constrained by time and distance. The introduction of antibiotics, vaccines, and industrial-scale sanitation transformed microbial ecosystems with unprecedented speed, altering selective pressures in ways that reverberate across biological and social systems. These interventions, while life-saving, did not conclude the silent war, but reshaped its terrain, compressing evolutionary cycles and amplifying unintended consequences. Antibiotics, in particular, represent a pivotal moment in this relationship, not because they eliminated microbes, but because they disrupted long-established equilibria. By exerting intense selective pressure over short time frames, they favored resistant strains capable of rapid adaptation, illustrating once again the asymmetry between human technological innovation and microbial evolutionary speed. Resistance did not emerge as an anomaly, but as an inevitability, a reminder that evolution operates continuously, indifferent to human intention. The rise of resistant pathogens is not merely a medical challenge, but an evolutionary signal, revealing the limits of intervention strategies that do not account for long-term coadaptation. At the same time, these interventions altered the human body itself, reshaping immune development and microbial composition in ways that extend beyond immediate therapeutic goals. Reduced exposure to environmental microbes during critical developmental windows modified immune calibration, contributing to patterns of dysregulation that manifest later in life. The immune system, sculpted by millennia of constant microbial interaction, encounters a modern environment that no longer mirrors ancestral conditions, creating a mismatch that reverberates through metabolism, inflammation, and neurological signaling. These effects accumulate subtly, often escaping immediate notice, yet they represent another chapter in the ongoing reshaping of human biology by microbial absence as much as presence. The concept of the human body as a bounded, autonomous entity becomes increasingly difficult to sustain under this lens. Instead, the body emerges as a porous system, defined not by isolation but by exchange, hosting microbial communities whose collective genetic material dwarfs that of the human genome itself. These communities do not merely coexist, they participate actively in physiological processes, modulating immune tolerance, synthesizing essential compounds, and influencing signaling pathways that extend into the central nervous system. The recognition that mental states can be influenced by microbial metabolites challenges traditional separations between body and mind, revealing another dimension through which invisible organisms shape subjective experience. This realization carries profound implications for how identity is understood. If aspects of mood, cognition, and behavior are partially contingent on microbial composition, then the boundaries of selfhood extend beyond human cells alone. Identity becomes a negotiated state, co-produced by host and symbiont, vulnerable to disruption through changes in diet, environment, or medical intervention. Such vulnerability reframes autonomy as a relative condition, contingent upon biological networks that operate largely beyond conscious regulation. The human experience, long framed as the domain of intention and reason, is thus revealed as deeply interwoven with processes that unfold at scales inaccessible to awareness. Social consequences follow from this biological entanglement. Public health policies, dietary norms, and urban planning decisions shape microbial exposure patterns across populations, influencing collective health trajectories in ways that may not become apparent for generations. Choices framed as progress or modernization carry evolutionary weight, redistributing selective pressures across societies unevenly. Disparities in exposure, access to medical care, and environmental quality translate into divergent microbial experiences, reinforcing inequalities that are both social and biological. In this sense, microbes continue to act as agents of stratification, amplifying existing divides through differential impact on bodies shaped by distinct ecological contexts. Globalization intensifies these dynamics by accelerating microbial circulation across the planet. Pathogens traverse borders with ease, exploiting interconnected systems designed for efficiency rather than resilience. Each outbreak exposes the fragility of infrastructures optimized for speed and scale, revealing how deeply human systems remain dependent on biological stability. The emergence of novel diseases often reflects ecological disruption, as habitat destruction and climate shifts alter microbial reservoirs and transmission pathways. These changes are not external to human activity, but consequences of it, illustrating how the silent invasion adapts to environments reshaped by human behavior. Climate change introduces another layer of complexity, expanding the geographical range of vectors and pathogens while stressing immune systems through nutritional and environmental strain. As temperatures rise and ecosystems shift, microbial landscapes reorganize, presenting human populations with unfamiliar challenges that outpace adaptive capacity. The evolutionary dialogue accelerates once more, compressing timelines and increasing uncertainty. Under these conditions, historical patterns repeat with new variables, reinforcing the continuity between past and present microbial influence, despite dramatic differences in context. Culturally, these pressures manifest in renewed narratives of control and vulnerability. Scientific authority coexists uneasily with persistent fear, as populations oscillate between trust in intervention and anxiety over unseen threats. The language of war resurfaces, framing microbes as enemies to be defeated rather than participants in a shared evolutionary process. This framing, while emotionally compelling, risks obscuring the systemic nature of the relationship, encouraging short-term solutions that exacerbate long-term instability. The persistence of this rhetoric reflects deep-seated cognitive patterns shaped by ancestral encounters with disease, where survival depended on rapid response rather than nuanced understanding. Education and communication become critical mediators in this landscape, translating complex biological realities into actionable knowledge without reinforcing fear-based narratives. Yet this translation is fraught with difficulty, as the abstract nature of microbial processes resists intuitive comprehension. Misalignment between perception and reality creates fertile ground for misinformation, which itself spreads through social networks with dynamics eerily analogous to infection. In this way, the metaphor of contagion extends beyond biology into information ecosystems, where ideas replicate, mutate, and exert selective pressure on collective behavior. The ethical dimension of this relationship grows increasingly prominent as technological capacity expands. Interventions such as genetic modification, microbiome engineering, and synthetic biology promise unprecedented influence over microbial ecosystems, raising questions about responsibility and foresight. Each alteration carries evolutionary implications that extend beyond immediate goals, potentially reshaping selective landscapes in unpredictable ways. The challenge lies not in acquiring power over microbes, but in cultivating restraint and understanding commensurate with that power, recognizing that evolutionary processes cannot be halted, only redirected. Throughout this unfolding narrative, one theme remains constant: invisibility. The most consequential forces shaping human evolution operate below perception, indifferent to intention, resistant to simplification. Awareness lags behind impact, creating a perpetual gap between cause and comprehension. This gap shapes emotional responses. policy decisions, and cultural narratives, often driving actions that prioritize immediacy over sustainability. To close this gap requires not only scientific literacy, but a shift in perspective, acknowledging that human history is inseparable from biological processes that defy anthropocentric framing. In confronting this reality, humanity faces a choice between perpetuating cycles of reaction and cultivating adaptive coexistence. The former promises clarity and confrontation, but often leads to escalation and instability. The latter demands humility and patience, accepting limits to control while seeking balance. Evolution favors neither ideology nor intention, only outcomes measured in survival and reproduction. Understanding this does not diminish human agency, but situates it within a broader system, where actions reverberate across scales and generations. The silent invasion thus persists, not as an external threat alone, but as an internal condition, woven into the fabric of human existence. Each generation inherits a biological legacy, shaped by microbial encounters it did not witness, carrying forward adaptations and vulnerabilities alike. The future of human evolution will be written not solely in laboratories or policies, but in the ongoing negotiation between visibility and invisibility, intention and consequence, human ambition and microbial persistence. Recognizing this negotiation as fundamental rather than incidental is the first step toward engaging with it responsibly, aware that the forces shaping humanity's tomorrow are already at work today, unseen yet inexorable. When the arc of human history is observed through the lens of microbial influence, the illusion of separation between past, present, and future begins to dissolve. What appears as modern crisis or unprecedented challenge reveals itself instead as a continuation of forces that have always operated beneath awareness, reshaping trajectories with quiet persistence. The silent invasions that once sculpted early immune systems now express themselves through different vectors, accelerated by technology and global interdependence, yet governed by the same evolutionary logic that has always favored adaptation over intention. Humanity stands not at the end of this process, but at a moment of heightened visibility, where consequences once diffused across centuries now emerge within a single lifetime. This compression of time alters perception without altering fundamentals. Microbes continue to exploit opportunity, adapting to ecological niches created by human expansion, environmental disruption, and social complexity. Each intervention generates a response. Each attempt at control reshapes the battlefield, not toward resolution, but toward transformation. The human desire for closure, for definitive victory over disease, collides with a biological reality that does not recognize endpoints. Evolution is not a narrative with a final chapter, but a system of continuous negotiation, indifferent to human concepts of progress or mastery. In this context, the future of human evolution becomes inseparable from collective choices that extend beyond medicine alone. Urban design, food systems, climate policy, and digital connectivity all contribute to microbial landscapes, redistributing selective pressures in ways that will only become fully visible generations later. The bodies of the future will bear the imprint of decisions made today, not as moral judgments, but as biological consequences, encoded silently, persistently, without commentary. This continuity challenges short-term thinking, demanding a temporal awareness rarely cultivated in political or cultural discourse. The psychological implications of this realization are profound. To accept that identity, health, and even cognition are partially shaped by invisible forces undermines narratives of absolute autonomy that dominate modern self-understanding. Yet this recognition does not diminish human dignity. It reframes it. Agency becomes relational rather than absolute, exercised within constraints rather than above them. The capacity to reflect on these constraints, to anticipate long-term consequences, becomes itself an evolutionary advantage, one that operates not at the level of genes alone, but at the level of collective behavior. Education, therefore, assumes a role that extends beyond information transmission. It becomes a form of immunization against simplistic narratives that promise control without cost. Understanding the coevolutionary relationship between humans and microbes fosters resilience not through fear, but through contextual awareness. Such awareness tempers reaction with reflection, reducing the likelihood of responses that solve immediate problems while sowing future instability. In a world where misinformation spreads with viral efficiency, cultivating this depth of understanding becomes a public health necessity as critical as any medical intervention. The language used to describe microbial threats matters profoundly, shaping emotional responses and policy decisions alike. Metaphors of war mobilize urgency but often obscure complexity, encouraging adversarial strategies that neglect coexistence and balance. Reframing the relationship in terms of ecology rather than conflict opens space for strategies that emphasize sustainability, diversity, and adaptive capacity. This shift does not imply passivity, but precision, aligning human action with evolutionary realities rather than rhetorical comfort. As biotechnology advances, the temptation to engineer definitive solutions intensifies. Gene editing, synthetic organisms, and targeted microbial manipulation promise unprecedented influence over biological systems. Yet each promise carries uncertainty proportional to its power. Evolution does not pause to evaluate intention. It responds to pressure. Interventions that ignore this dynamic risk amplifying the very problems they seek to eliminate, reinforcing the lesson that complexity cannot be bypassed without consequence. Responsibility, in this context, is not the avoidance of action, but the integration of foresight into every layer of decision-making. The story of silent invasions is therefore not a tale of defeat or domination, but of entanglement. Humans and microbes are locked in a relationship that defies simple categorization, oscillating between antagonism and symbiosis, destruction and creation. This entanglement has shaped not only bodies but civilizations, belief systems, and modes of thought. It has influenced how humans organize care, interpret suffering, and imagine the boundaries of selfhood. To overlook this influence is to misunderstand the foundations of human existence itself. Looking forward, the question is not whether microbial forces will continue to shape human evolution, but how consciously humanity will engage with this process. Awareness does not confer immunity, but it offers orientation. It allows societies to move from reactive cycles toward adaptive strategies that respect the scale and persistence of invisible forces. Such strategies require patience, interdisciplinary collaboration, and a willingness to accept uncertainty as an intrinsic feature of life rather than a failure of planning. Ultimately, the most significant shift prompted by this perspective is existential, rather than technical. It invites a redefinition of what it means to be human, not as a species standing apart from nature, but as a node within a vast dynamic network of life. Microbes are not anomalies within this network. They are fundamental participants, shaping outcomes through interactions too small to see yet too powerful to ignore. Human evolution, viewed through this lens, becomes a story not of solitary ascent, but of shared adaptation, written collaboratively across scales of existence. The silent invasions that have accompanied humanity from its origins are not relics of a primitive past, nor harbingers of inevitable decline. They are expressions of a living system in constant motion, one that demands humility as much as ingenuity. To engage with this system wisely is to recognize that survival has never depended on isolation or dominance alone, but on the capacity to adapt within complexity, to listen to forces that do not speak, and to act with awareness that the smallest agents often carry the greatest influence. In acknowledging this, humanity does not surrender control, but recalibrates it, aligning ambition with understanding, intervention with restraint, and progress with responsibility. The future, shaped as always by invisible companions, remains unwritten not because it is uncontrollable, but because it is alive, responsive, and deeply interconnected. The silent invasions continue, but so does the opportunity to evolve alongside them, with intention informed by insight, aware that what cannot be seen has always been among the most powerful forces guiding who we are and who we are yet to become.